photograph arrived at the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum on a grey afternoon in March 1996, shipped from Memphis, Tennessee, in a package that had traveled 6,000 miles to deliver something that should not exist. The museum curator, a woman named Keiko Yamada, who had catalogued thousands of artifacts from the war, held the image under her desk lamp and felt her hands begin to shake. Black and white, slightly faded, professionally composed. In the center stood a tall black American soldier in full military uniform, his posture rigid but his eyes soft. Surrounding him, arranged in careful rows like a choir, were 200 Japanese women, elderly women, women in traditional kimono, women holding a banner with characters brushed in careful calligraphy. "We need him." Keiko had worked at the museum for 17 years. She had seen photographs of destruction, of shadows burned into stone, of children with eyes that had seen too much. But she had never seen anything like this. The photograph violated every regulation of the American occupation. Soldiers were forbidden from fraternizing with Japanese civilians. Black soldiers were segregated from their own units, housed separately, fed, separately assigned the worst duties in the worst locations. And Japanese civilians organizing a public demonstration in support of an occupying soldier. That was 15 different violations of military law, any one of which could result in imprisonment or worse. Yet here was the evidence mounted on aging photographic paper, real as bone. Keiko turned the frame over. Taped to the back was a letter, handwritten on paper, so thin it was nearly transparent. "My name is James Mitchell. I am 80 years old. I carried this photograph in my wallet for 50 years. Now I am dying, and I want the world to know what these women did. I want the world to know that love survived when everything else burned." If you're finding this story compelling, please hit that like button and subscribe. This is a true story that almost disappeared from history. Your support helps us preserve these moments that prove humanity can survive anything. The photograph was dated January the 15th, 1946, but the story began 5 months earlier in the ruins of a country that had just surrendered. Hiroshima Prefecture, August 17th, 1945, 11 days after the bomb. The American occupation forces were rolling through Japan like a tide that nobody could stop, and in the small farming village of Takasaki, the women gathered at the shrine with the kind of determination that comes only from having already lost everything. They had survived firebombing raids that turned the sky into something from hell. They had buried children and husbands and brothers. They had eaten bark and roots when the rice disappeared. They had lived through 4 years of propaganda, telling them that American soldiers were demons who would rape their daughters and burn their homes and laugh while doing it. Now the demons were coming and there was nothing left to do but wait. Fumiko Watanabe stood at the front of the group, 74 years old, her body so thin that her kimono hung on her frame like fabric draped over wire. She weighed 68 pounds. The number was precise because the village doctor had weighed her 3 days earlier and told her gently that she needed to eat more, and she had laughed in his face because there was nothing more to eat. Her son, Takeshi, had died at Okinawa in April. He was 18 years old. He had written her letters about how they were fighting for the emperor, for Japan, for everything that mattered. The last letter arrived 2 weeks after the telegram informing her of his death. Standing beside Fumiko was Chio Nakamura, 68, who had lost 2 sons, one at Iwo Jima, one at Guadalcanal. She had their photographs wrapped in silk in her home, and every morning she bowed to them and apologized for surviving when they had not. And there was Hisako Tanaka, 62, the youngest of the 3, whose son had been wounded at Saipan and died 3 days later from infection because there were no antibiotics left, no medicine, nothing but prayers that God had apparently stopped listening to. 3 women who had given everything to a war that took everything and gave back only silence. They stood at the well near the shrine, hauling water, because wells do not care about surrender or occupation or grief. Water still needs to be drawn. Life still demands its small rituals. That was when the soldier appeared. He was impossibly tall by Japanese standards, well over 6 feet, with skin as dark as the night sky, and eyes that seemed to carry their own weight of exhaustion. He wore the uniform of a private in the United States Army, the fabric worn but clean, his rifle slung over his shoulder in a way that suggested he was deeply uncomfortable holding it. He carried a map that he clearly did not understand and a canteen that was empty. Most American soldiers traveled in groups, loud and commanding, their voices carrying across the village like declarations of conquest. This one came alone, walking slowly through the narrow streets as if he was trying very hard not to be noticed. When he reached the well, the three women froze. Fumiko's hands locked on the rope. Chiyo took a step backward. Hisako's breath caught in her throat. 4 years of propaganda had taught them what to expect. Violence, cruelty, the brutality of conquerors who had won and knew it. But the soldier did something that shattered every expectation they had been taught to hold. He bowed, not a casual nod, a genuine bow, deep and respectful, the kind of bow that acknowledged their presence as human beings worthy of respect. Then he spoke, his voice low and careful, his Japanese so mangled that it was almost incomprehensible, but the effort so sincere that it cut through every barrier of language and history. Sumimasen, mizu, onegaishimasu, excuse me, water, please. The accent was terrible, the grammar was broken, but the attempt itself created something that none of them had expected to feel again. Recognition. This was not a conqueror, this was a human being tired and lost and asking for help. Chiyo, the boldest of the three, felt her carefully maintained composure begin to dissolve. She had spent 11 days preparing to hate the Americans with every fiber of her being. She had rehearsed the contempt, the cold silence, the absolute refusal to cooperate. But this man had said, "Please." She nodded slowly and gestured to the bucket. The soldier smiled, and it was not the smile of someone who had won a war. It was the smile of someone who was grateful not to be rejected. He filled his canteen, bowed again, and said something in English that none of them understood. Then he reached into his pack and pulled out 3 small chocolate bars, American military rations, and placed them carefully on the edge of the well. He pointed to the chocolate, then to the women, then bowed a 3rd time and walked away. The 3 women stared at the chocolate for a long moment. Fumiko picked one up. The wrapper was printed in English. She had not seen chocolate in 4 years. Before the war, it had been an expensive luxury. During the war, it had been impossible. "He gave us his food," Chiyo whispered. Hisako shook her head slowly. "They told us the Americans would take everything. They did not tell us they would give." The soldier's name was Private James Mitchell, 23 years old, from Memphis, Tennessee. He had been assigned to manage the transition in rural areas where American military presence was sparse. The assignment was not an honor. It was punishment disguised as duty. Black soldiers in the United States Army were given the worst assignments, the most dangerous patrols, the jobs that nobody else wanted. Mitchell had fought his way across Europe, had survived battles that killed better men, and had come home to an army that still made him sleep separately from white soldiers, eat separately, exist separately. Now he was in Japan alone most days, walking through villages where people looked at him with the kind of fear that he recognized from Memphis. The fear of someone who has been taught that you are dangerous simply because of what you look like. He hated that fear. He had grown up with it. And he had decided somewhere between Memphis and Takasaki that he would not contribute to it. So when he saw the 3 elderly women at the well, women so thin they looked like they might blow away in a strong wind, he bowed. Because his mother had taught him to respect his elders, and the war had not taken that from him. He returned to the well the next day, and the day after that. Each time the women were there, hauling water, and each time Mitchell helped pull the rope. He could lift the bucket with one hand that took all 3 of them to manage together. He did not make a show of it. He simply helped the way you help neighbors, the way you help people who need it. Fumiko began teaching him words. She would point to the bucket and say, "Baketsu," point to the water and say, "Mizu," point to the sky and say, "Sora." Mitchell would repeat the words, his pronunciation terrible, but improving, and Fumiko would smile despite herself. Chiyo started bringing him things, a small towel to wipe his face, a piece of dried fruit that she had been saving for a special occasion that would never come. Gestures so small they were almost invisible, but gestures that said, "You are not our enemy." Hisako simply sat with him, sometimes not speaking, because they had no language in common, but sitting in the kind of comfortable silence that requires no translation. Within 2 weeks, something impossible had happened. The women of Takasaki had adopted an American soldier. September arrived with heat that felt like punishment, and Mitchell became woven into the fabric of village life in ways that violated every regulation in the occupation manual. He helped repair buildings damaged by bombing, using skills he had learned working construction in Memphis before the war. He taught English to the village children, simple words and phrases that made them laugh at his attempts to pronounce their names. He used his position to ensure that ration distributions were fair, that the village received what it was entitled to receive, and the women, in turn, saved food for him. This was not a small thing, this was everything. Takasaki was starving, the rice harvest had failed, the supply lines were destroyed, calories were counted like currency, and every grain of rice was precious. But Fumiko, Chiyo, and Hisako began setting aside portions of whatever they managed to scavenge or grow. They wrapped the food in leaves and gave it to Mitchell, who understood that accepting it meant accepting something more profound than charity. It meant accepting that they trusted him, that they had chosen to see him as someone worth keeping alive. One evening in mid-September, Chiyo invited Mitchell to her home. The house was small, barely larger than a single room in an American home, but it was clean and carefully maintained. She gestured for him to sit, and he sat cross-legged on the floor the way Fumiko had taught him, his long legs folded awkwardly but his posture respectful. Chiyo disappeared into the kitchen area and returned carrying a small plate with 3 onigiri rice balls wrapped in dark green nori seaweed. She placed the plate in front of Mitchell and said a single word, "Tabete." Eat. Mitchell picked up one of the rice balls. It was still warm. He could feel the heat through the seaweed, could smell the subtle sweetness of the rice mixed with something sharp and vinegary. He bit into it, and the world narrowed to that single moment. The nori was crispy, crackling between his teeth, with a texture that was both delicate and substantial. Then came the rice, warm and sticky, each grain distinct, but clinging together in perfect unity. And at the center, hidden like a secret, was a single umeboshi, a pickled plum, so intensely sour that it made his eyes water. The sourness hit first sharp and almost aggressive, making his mouth pucker. Then came the salt, deep and mineral. Then somehow a subtle sweetness that emerged from beneath the acid like a sunrise breaking through storm clouds. Mitchell had eaten military rations for 2 years. He had eaten K rations and C rations and whatever the mess hall served to soldiers who were kept separate from the main dining area. He had eaten food that was designed for survival, not for pleasure. This was different. This was food made by someone who cared whether he enjoyed it. He finished the first rice ball and reached for the second, and Chiyo smiled in a way that made her whole face transform. For just a moment she looked like someone who had not lost 2 sons. She looked like someone who still believed that small acts of kindness could matter. Mitchell ate slowly, trying to make the experience last, trying to memorize every texture and flavor because he understood even then that this moment was precious. When he finished, he bowed low, his forehead nearly touching the table, and said the words that Fumiko had taught him. "Gochisu-sama deshita." Thank you for the meal. Chiyo bowed in return, and when she straightened, there were tears running down her face. "My son loved onigiri," she said in Japanese, knowing that Mitchell could not understand the words but needing to say them anyway. "I made these with the last rice I had been saving. I saved it for him, but he will never come home. So I give it to you because you are here and you are kind, and maybe that is what my son would have wanted." Mitchell did not understand the words, but he understood the emotion. He reached across the space between them and placed his hand over hers, And they sat like that for a long moment, two people from countries that had tried to destroy each other, sharing grief in a language that required no translation. Outside, the September sun was setting over Takasaki, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that looked like fire, but felt for the first time in years like hope. The order came on a cold morning in late September, delivered by a young corporal who looked embarrassed to be the messenger. Private James Mitchell was being transferred to Tokyo, effective in 10 days. From there, he would be reassigned to occupation headquarters or possibly shipped back to the United States. The transfer was presented as routine rotation, standard military procedure, nothing personal. But everyone understood what it really meant. Mitchell's presence in Takasaki had become a problem. His relationship with the Japanese civilians was too comfortable, too genuine, too visible. It threatened the clean separation that the occupation authority wanted to maintain between conqueror and conquered, between American soldier and Japanese civilian, between the men who had won and the people who had lost. The military needed distance. It needed hierarchy. It needed the Japanese to understand that they were occupied, not befriended. Mitchell sat in the small room he had been assigned, a converted storage shed behind the village administrative building, and read the transfer order 3 times. The paper felt thin in his hands, but the words carried the weight of absolute authority. He had 10 days. 10 days to leave behind the first place since Memphis, where people had looked at him and seen a human being before they saw his skin color. 10 days to abandon the women who had shared their last rice with him, who had taught him their language, who had chosen to trust him when everything in their world told them not to. He could comply. He could pack his bag, board the transport, disappear into the machinery of military bureaucracy. That was what soldiers did. That was what orders meant. But something had changed in Mitchell during his months in Takasaki. Something fundamental had shifted in the space between who he had been and who he was becoming. He thought about Chio's tears when she gave him the onigiri. He thought about Fumiko teaching him Japanese with the patience of someone who had nothing but time and everything to give. He thought about Hisako sitting with him in comfortable silence, two people who had survived different hells, learning to exist in the same quiet space. He thought about Memphis, about the way white soldiers treated him, about sleeping in separate quarters and eating at separate tables, and being told his entire life that he was less than that. He should be grateful for whatever scraps of dignity they chose to throw his way. And he thought, not this time. Mitchell pulled out a piece of paper and began to write. The letter took him 3 hours to compose, crossing out words, starting over, trying to find language that would convey what he needed to say without sounding insubordinate, without sounding crazy, without sounding like a soldier who had forgotten his place. To Colonel Richardson, Commanding Officer, Hiroshima, Prefecture. Occupation Authorities, sir. I write to respectfully request reconsideration of my transfer orders, dated September 28, 1945. I understand that my assignment to Takasaki was intended to be temporary. I understand that military necessity requires rotation of personnel. I understand that regulations exist for good reason. But I believe that what we are building here in this village matters more than routine procedure. The women of Takasaki have lost sons and husbands to this war. They had every reason to hate American soldiers. They had every reason to resist occupation, to make our jobs difficult, to treat us as enemies. Instead, they chose to see us as human beings. They chose to teach rather than resist. They chose to build peace rather than nurture resentment. I am the first American many of these people have ever met. I am the first Black American most of them have ever seen. And they have shown me kindness that I have rarely experienced in my own country. If I leave now, if I am transferred, because our relationship has become too comfortable, we send a message that peace is not what we want. We send a message that connection is dangerous. We send a message that the categories of enemy and friend are permanent, unchangeable. I respectfully refuse this transfer. I request permission to remain in Takasaki until the occupation mission here is complete. I understand this may result in disciplinary action. I accept that consequence. But I will not abandon people who refused to abandon their humanity even after we bombed their cities and killed their children. Respectfully submitted, Private James Mitchell. He sealed the letter and hand-delivered it to the courier station, watching it disappear into the military mail system like a stone dropped into deep water. Then he walked to the well where he had first met Fumiko, Chiyo, and Hisako. The three women were there as they always were, drawing water in the morning light. Fumiko saw his face and knew immediately that something had changed. "Nani ga okota?" she asked. What happened? Mitchell's Japanese had improved over the months, but it was still limited. He struggled to find the words. "Watashi wa..." "Transfer. Tokyo, 10 days. The bucket Chiyo was holding slipped from her hands and hit the ground with a hollow thud. Hisako's face went very still, the kind of stillness that comes from having absorbed too much loss to show emotion anymore. But Fumiko's eyes narrowed, and when she spoke, her voice carried the kind of authority that comes from being 74 years old and having survived everything the world could throw at you. "No," she said in English, one of the few English words she knew. Then she switched to Japanese, speaking rapidly, her words sharp and decisive. "We will not accept this. You have shown us that peace is possible. You have shown our children that enemies can become friends. You have given us hope when we had none. We will not let them take you away." Mitchell tried to explain that military orders were not negotiable, that he had already refused the transfer and would likely face consequences, that there was nothing they could do. But Fumiko was already walking away, her thin body moving with surprising speed and purpose. What happened over the next 3 days would become legend in Takasaki, a story passed down through generations, embellished and mythologized, but rooted in something undeniably real. Fumiko called a meeting at the shrine. Not just the three women who had befriended Mitchell, not just the families who had interacted with him directly, every woman in the village who had lost someone to the war. Every widow, every mother, every sister and daughter who understood what it meant to survive when the people you loved had not. 200 women gathered in the shrine courtyard on the evening of September 30th. The youngest was 17, the oldest was 84. They represented every family in Takasaki, every home that had been touched by loss. Fumiko stood before them, her 68-pound frame somehow commanding the space like she weighed twice that. "The Americans are taking Private Mitchell away," she said, her voice steady. "They say he has become too close to us. They say his presence here violates regulations. They say that soldiers and civilians must remain separate." She paused, letting the words settle. "I say, we reject this separation. I say we tell them that Private Mitchell has done more to build peace in 3 months than their entire army has done in 3 weeks. I say we demand that he stays." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. This was dangerous territory. Japanese civilians did not make demands of the occupation authority. They accepted, they complied, they survived by making themselves invisible. But Chiyo stepped forward, standing beside Fumiko. "My sons died believing they were fighting for something that mattered," she said quietly. "I do not know if that was true, but I know that Private Mitchell has shown me that their deaths do not have to mean nothing. He has shown me that former enemies can choose differently. If he leaves, that possibility leaves with him." Hisako joined them, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying in the evening air. "I am tired of losing people I care about. I am tired of watching good men disappear because someone decided they were in the wrong place. Private Mitchell is in the right place. Let us tell them so." One by one, women stood. Some spoke, some simply nodded, but the message was clear. They would not accept this transfer quietly. Fumiko produced a sheet of rice paper, expensive and rare, something she had been saving for years for a purpose that had never materialized. Until now. She ground ink carefully, preparing the calligraphy tools with the precision of someone who understood that words, when written with proper respect, carried power. Then she began to write. The characters flowed across the paper in elegant strokes, each one deliberate, each one weighted with meaning. "We need him. Private Mitchell has brought honor to our village. He has shown respect to our customs and our grief. He has helped us rebuild what war destroyed. We ask that he be permitted to remain. We need more time with him. Please stay." But this was not really a petition, this was a declaration, a statement that peace could not be imposed from above. It had to be built from below person, by person choice, by choice act of kindness, by act of kindness. By the next morning, every woman in the village had signed it, 200 signatures, each one written carefully beside the person's name. Some signed with tears streaming down their faces, some signed with hands that shook from age or malnutrition or fear. Some signed quickly as if afraid they would lose courage if they hesitated. They did not discuss potential consequences. They did not debate whether such an action might bring punishment from the occupational authority. They simply did what needed to be done the way they had been doing difficult things their entire lives. Chio volunteered to deliver the petition. She dressed in her finest kimono, the one she had saved through 4 years of war, despite poverty, despite rationing, despite every practical reason to sell it for food. She wanted to arrive exactly as she was, an elderly Japanese woman who had lived through hell and emerged with her dignity intact. The district occupation headquarters was 15 miles away in the larger town of Saijo. Chio walked the entire distance. She was 68 years old. She weighed perhaps 90 pounds. She had not eaten a full meal in 3 years. But she walked 15 miles through September heat because the petition needed to be delivered by someone who understood what it cost to create it. It took her 7 hours. Colonel Thomas Richardson was from Georgia, 56 years old, career military, a man who had spent 3 decades learning how to make difficult decisions without letting emotion interfere with duty. He had received plenty of complaints during the occupation. Grievances about ration distributions, requests for medical supplies, protests about curfews, and movement restrictions. He had processed them all with the efficiency of someone who understood that occupation was fundamentally about control, about establishing order in chaos. But he had never received anything like this. His aide brought the petition into his office at 3 in the afternoon on October the 2nd, along with a note that the elderly Japanese woman who delivered it was waiting outside, refusing to leave until she received a response. Richardson unrolled the rice paper carefully. The calligraphy was beautiful, precise, the kind of writing that required years of practice and absolute respect for the act of putting words to paper. He read it slowly, his aide translating the formal Japanese into English. When he finished, he sat very still for a long moment. Then he did something he had not done since receiving the telegram about his son's death at Iwo Jima. He wept, not loud, not dramatic, just quiet tears running down his face while he held a petition from 200 Japanese women asking that an American soldier be allowed to stay in their village. His aide shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to respond. Richardson wiped his face and stood. "Bring her in," he said quietly. "Bring Mrs. Nakamura in." Chio entered the office with the kind of dignity that made her small frame seem larger. She bowed deeply, properly, showing respect, without showing submission. Richardson bowed in return, which shocked both Chio and the translator standing beside her. American officers did not bow to Japanese civilians. It was not done. It violated every unspoken rule of occupation. But Richardson had read the petition. He had seen 200 signatures from women who had lost everything and still chose to fight for the humanity of a single soldier. He gestured for Chio to sit. She sat carefully, her posture perfect, despite obvious exhaustion. "Mrs. Nakamura," Richardson said slowly, waiting for the translation, "this petition is extraordinary. Do you understand what you are asking?" The translator relayed the question. Chio's response was immediate and unwavering. "We are not asking for his humanity. We know it already exists. We are asking that you recognize it." Richardson felt tears he had thought were finished break free again. He had spent 3 decades in the military. He had fought in 2 wars. He had given orders that sent men to their deaths. He had done his duty without question because that was what soldiers did. But his son had died at Iwo Jima believing he was fighting for freedom, for democracy, for the idea that all men deserved dignity. And here was a Japanese woman, a woman whose country had killed his son, asking him to honor that principle by letting one black soldier remain in a village where people had learned to love him. "Private Mitchell has violated regulations," Richardson said carefully. "His presence in your village has become complicated." Chio waited for the translation, then responded. "War was complicated, occupation is complicated, but kindness is simple. He was kind. We were kind. If you say that is complicated, then your regulations are wrong." Richardson smiled despite himself. This 70-pound woman had just told a colonel in the United States Army that his regulations were wrong, and she was right. "Tell me," he said quietly, "if Private Mitchell stays, what do you believe will happen?" Chio's answer was immediate. "We will show that peace is possible, that it is something people build, not something governments order. We will show that after war ends, enemies can become friends. Our children will see it, and they will be better than we were." Richardson stood and walked to the window, overlooking the compound. Outside, American soldiers were going about their duties, maintaining order, processing paperwork, doing the 1,000 small tasks that occupation required. None of them were building peace. They were maintaining control. There was a difference. He turned back to Chio. "I cannot guarantee that Private Mitchell will be allowed to stay permanently. That decision is above my authority, but I can delay his transfer. I can send this petition to Tokyo with my recommendation that exceptions be made for situations where genuine cooperation has been achieved. Sometimes the right people need to be reminded what we are occupying for." The translator relayed this. Chio bowed so deeply that her forehead nearly touched the floor. When she straightened, there were tears on her face, but she was smiling. Words spread through Takasaki like electricity through copper wire. The women had won. Temporarily, perhaps. Conditionally, certainly. But they had won. Private Mitchell would remain in the village pending further orders from Tokyo. The transfer was suspended, not cancelled, but suspended was enough. Mitchell stood at the well when Fumiko told him, and for the first time since leaving Memphis, he felt something that he had almost forgotten existed. Hope. Not the desperate hope of survival, not the grim hope of making it through another day, but genuine hope that the world could be different than it had been, that the categories of enemy and friend were not permanent, that love could exist in the wreckage of war. But Richardson's decision, while compassionate, had created a different kind of problem, because if Tokyo decided to honor the petition, if someone in the military bureaucracy ruled that maintaining good relations with the civilian population was worth keeping one private in place, it would set a precedent. Other soldiers might request similar arrangements. Other communities might organize. The occupation force would become a place where decisions were negotiated rather than imposed. That was not how military organizations functioned. The pressure came down within a week. 3 separate inspections of Takasaki were conducted by officers from Tokyo. They looked for any indication that Mitchell was engaged in unauthorized activities, fraternization, that violated regulations, anything that could justify his immediate reassignment. They found nothing. He was following every protocol, maintaining proper distance, even as the women continued their quiet acts of support. But the real pressure was building somewhere else, in offices in Tokyo, where colonels and generals were reading the petition and trying to decide what it meant. 200 Japanese women had organized to protect an American soldier. That could be interpreted as successful occupation, as evidence that hearts and minds were being won. Or it could be interpreted as dangerous precedent, as evidence that the clean lines of military authority were being blurred by sentiment and personal connection. The decision would come from Tokyo. But everyone in Takasaki knew it was coming. The only question was what it would say. The answer from Tokyo arrived on November 3rd, 1945, delivered in a sealed envelope marked with enough official stamps to make clear that this was not a suggestion. Major Harold Bradford would be arriving in Takasaki within 48 hours to conduct a comprehensive review of Private Mitchell's assignment and the petition situation. Colonel Richardson read the orders twice, then placed them carefully on his desk and poured himself a whiskey, even though it was only 10 in the morning. He knew Bradford's reputation, North Carolina, career officer, a man who believed that discipline was the foundation of military effectiveness and that any deviation from established protocol was a crack in that foundation that would eventually bring the whole structure down. Richardson also knew, though it was never stated in official records, that Bradford had particular views about racial integration in the military, views that made him deeply uncomfortable with the idea of a black soldier being celebrated by civilians of any nationality. This was not going to end well. Major Bradford arrived on a cold November morning, stepping off the transport vehicle with the kind of rigid posture that suggested he had a manual where his spine should be. He was 48 years old, clean-shaven, his uniform so precisely pressed it looked like it would cut you if you touched it. He spent his first day in Takasaki conducting interviews, not with Mitchell, not with the village women, with other American personnel stationed in the region, asking careful questions about fraternization, about unauthorized contact, about whether Private Mitchell had shown proper respect for military hierarchy. He found nothing actionable. Mitchell followed every regulation. He slept in assigned quarters, ate military rations, reported for duty exactly on time. His paperwork was immaculate, but Bradford was looking for something else, something that could not be captured in violation reports or duty logs. He was looking for evidence that the clean separation between occupier and occupied had been compromised, and in that he found everything he needed. On his second day, Bradford called Mitchell to his temporary office in the village administrative building. Mitchell entered, saluted precisely, stood at attention. Bradford let him stand there for a long moment before speaking. "Private Mitchell, I have read the petition submitted by the women of this village. 200 signatures requesting that you be allowed to remain here. That is quite remarkable." "Yes, sir." "It is also quite problematic. Do you understand why?" Mitchell kept his eyes forward. "Sir, I believe I have fulfilled my duties according to regulations." "Your duties, yes, but duties are not the issue here, Private. The issue is the nature of your relationship with these civilians. You have become integrated into their community in ways that were never intended." "Sir, my assignment was to manage transition and build cooperation with the local population. Cooperation, Private, not friendship. Not the kind of personal connection that leads 200 women to petition for your presence as if you were a member of their families rather than a soldier in an occupying army." Bradford stood and walked to the window looking out at the village. "Do you know what happens if we allow this to continue? If we permit soldiers to form these kinds of attachments to the civilian population, the entire structure of occupation collapses. We are here to maintain order, to ensure compliance, to rebuild this country according to terms of surrender. We are not here to make friends." Mitchell remained silent, knowing that anything he said would be used against him. Bradford turned back. "Effective immediately, you are prohibited from all personal contact with village civilians outside of official duties. You will not enter their homes. You will not accept food or gifts. You will not engage in social interaction of any kind. Any violation of these directives will result in immediate court-martial. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir." "Furthermore, you will inform the village women that their petition has been reviewed and denied. You are being reassigned. The transfer will occur at the end of December. Until then, you will maintain absolute professional distance. Is that clear?" Something inside Mitchell wanted to refuse, wanted to tell this officer that the women of Takasaki had shown him more human dignity in 3 months than the United States Army had shown him in 2 years of service, wanted to explain that the peace they were supposed to be building could not be built through separation and hierarchy, but he had already refused one transfer order. He had already pushed military authority as far as it could be pushed. "Yes, sir." Crystal clear. Mitchell did not go to the well that evening, or the next evening, or the evening after that. Fumiko noticed first. She stood by the well as the sun set, scanning the narrow village streets, waiting for the tall figure that always appeared around this time. When he did not come, she felt something cold settle in her chest. By the third day, all 3 women understood what had happened. The military had separated Mitchell from them. Not through transfer yet, but through prohibition. They had built a wall of regulations between him and the people who cared whether he lived or died. It was crueler than simply taking him away, because he was still here, still visible in the village during official duties, still present, but untouchable. like watching someone drown behind glass. Chiyo tried to approach him once in the market square where he was supervising ration distribution. She walked up slowly, intending to ask if he was well, if he needed anything. Mitchell saw her coming and turned away, his face rigid, his body language screaming that she should not come closer. Chiyo stopped as if she had hit a physical barrier. She understood immediately. He was not rejecting her. He was protecting her. Whatever orders he had received, they came with consequences that would fall on both of them if she violated the new boundaries. That night, the three women gathered at Fumiko's home. They sat in silence for a long time, drinking weak tea, staring at the low table where Mitchell had sat so many times, learning to use chopsticks, laughing at his mistakes, becoming part of their lives. "They have taken him from us without taking him," Hisako said quietly. "This is worse than transfer." Fumiko's hands were shaking. At 74, weighing 68 pounds, she did not have many resources left, but she had one thing that 4 years of war had not taken from her: stubbornness. "Then we adapt," she said. "If he cannot come to us, we go to him, carefully, invisibly." Chiyo looked up. "How they are watching!" "They are watching for direct contact. They are watching for violations of the orders, but they are not watching the children." Within 2 days, a new pattern emerged in Takasaki. Groups of village children began appearing at the military compound where Mitchell was stationed ostensibly for English lessons. The occupation authority had encouraged such programs. Education was part of building cooperation, part of preparing Japan for democratic reconstruction. The children were legitimate. The lessons were real. Mitchell genuinely taught them English words and phrases, wrote letters on a chalkboard he had requisitioned, corrected their pronunciation. But the children also carried things: a small package wrapped in cloth, a note written in careful Japanese characters, news from the village from Fumiko and Chiyo and Hisako, delivered in the pockets of 7-year-olds and 10-year-olds who treated the smuggling operation like an elaborate game. Mitchell would teach the lesson, and while the children practiced writing English words, he would quietly retrieve whatever had been hidden in their bags: a rice ball wrapped in leaves, a letter telling him that Fumiko's cough was getting worse, a small drawing from Hisako showing the well where they had first met. He could not respond directly, but he could ensure that certain children received extra rations to take home. He could make sure that the families helping him were first in line when medical supplies became available. He could find ways to say thank you without words. Major Bradford noticed the English lessons but saw nothing wrong with them. They were official. They were educational. They served occupation goals. He did not notice the rice balls or the letters or the quiet system of mutual support that continued to function beneath his regulations like an underground river. December arrived early that year, and with it came cold that cut through thin walls and thinner bodies like knives. The first winter after surrender was brutal across Japan, but in rural areas like Takasaki, it was catastrophic. The rice harvest had failed. Coal for heating was non-existent. The American occupation provided basic rations, but basic meant survival, not comfort. It meant enough calories to not die, but not enough to stay warm or healthy or strong. The village women, already malnourished, began showing signs of serious decline. Hisako was the first to collapse. She was 62 years old. Her son had died at Saipan. She had been giving portions of her already insufficient rations to her grandchildren, trying to ensure that the next generation survived, even if hers did not. On December 8th, she fainted while hauling water from the well. One of the children ran to get help and found Mitchell supervising a construction detail half a mile away. The child grabbed his hand and pulled, speaking rapid Japanese that Mitchell only partially understood, but the urgency was clear. Mitchell dropped his tools and ran. He found Hisako on the ground near the well, unconscious, her breathing shallow, her skin grey. Fumiko and Chiyo were kneeling beside her, trying to wake her, their own hands shaking from cold and fear. Mitchell checked her pulse, weak, checked her breathing, laboured, checked her skin temperature, too cold, malnutrition, hypothermia, possibly pneumonia. She needed a hospital. She needed antibiotics. She needed treatment that the village did not have. He looked up at Fumiko and made a decision that would either save Hisako's life or end his military career. "I'm taking her to the medical facility." Fumiko shook her head. "They will not treat Japanese civilians, only emergency cases." "Then I'll make it an emergency." Mitchell lifted Hisako as carefully as he could. Her body felt insubstantial as paper, like lifting a bundle of sticks wrapped in cloth. He carried her through the village streets toward the military compound, moving quickly but carefully, ignoring the stares of other soldiers, ignoring everything except the need to get this woman medical attention. The medical officer on duty was a captain from Ohio named Peter Walsh. He looked up from his desk when Mitchell entered, carrying an unconscious Japanese woman, and immediately understood that he was watching something very irregular occurring. Private civilians are supposed to go through proper channels for medical. "She's dying, sir. Malnutrition and hypothermia. She needs fluids and antibiotics immediately." Walsh stood slowly. "Private, you are aware that medical supplies are allocated according to—" "Sir, with all due respect, she's dying right now. We can discuss allocation after we save her life." Something in Mitchell's voice made Walsh pause. This was not insubordination, this was desperation. Walsh looked at the woman in Mitchell's arms, looked at her grey skin, her shallow breathing, her body that weighed less than a child. "Put her on the examination table." Walsh worked quickly, efficiently, without commentary. He started an IV for fluids. He administered penicillin. He wrapped Hisako in military blankets and monitored her vitals. After 30 minutes, her breathing stabilized. After an hour, some color returned to her face. She would live. Walsh turned to Mitchell, who had been standing at attention the entire time, waiting for the consequences he knew were coming. "Private, you have violated approximately 7 different regulations in the last 90 minutes. You removed yourself from your assigned duty without permission. You brought an unauthorized civilian into a military medical facility. You demanded treatment that should have gone through proper administrative channels." "Yes, sir." "You also saved that woman's life." Walsh cleaned his instruments slowly, not looking at Mitchell. "I'm going to file this as emergency humanitarian treatment. The penicillin is technically unauthorized use of military medical supplies for a non-military person. That's theft by regulation, even if it saved her life. Bradford will see it that way. I can bury this in paperwork for maybe a week. After that, it's going to reach his desk. You understand what that means?" "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." Walsh shook his head. "Don't thank me. I'm just delaying the inevitable." Hisako recovered slowly over the next week, staying in Fumiko's home where the women could care for her. The penicillin had stopped the infection. The IV fluids had addressed the dehydration, but the underlying malnutrition remained. The village women did something that would have been unthinkable weeks earlier. They began to organize, not just Fumiko and Chiyo and the women who had signed the petition, the younger women, the teenagers, even some of the children, understanding that something important was happening, even if they could not articulate exactly what. They created a distribution system so complex and subtle that it was nearly invisible. One family would save a portion of their rations, another would contribute firewood, another would provide blankets. The contributions were tiny, almost negligible individually, but collectively they ensured that Hisako had enough to survive, that Fumiko and Chiyo, also declining, had enough to continue functioning, that the burden of deprivation was spread across the entire community rather than concentrated on the elderly, and they ensured that Mitchell, still prohibited from direct contact, still received small portions of whatever they managed to set aside. He tried to refuse, he tried to return the food through the children, tried to redirect the supplies to the families who needed them more, but the message that came back, delivered by a 10-year-old girl with serious eyes, was unambiguous. Fumiko-san says, "You are family, family shares. Do not insult us by refusing." Mitchell sat alone in his quarters that night, holding a small package that contained 2 rice balls and a piece of dried fish, and understood that he was witnessing something that would define the rest of his life. These women were not helping him because they wanted something from him. They were helping him because they had decided that helping each other was what human beings did, regardless of nationality or race, or the regulations that said they should remain separate. They were building peace. Not the peace that governments negotiated in treaty rooms, but the peace that was constructed day by day through small acts of shared humanity. But before Bradford's summons came, something happened that would become Mitchell's most treasured memory of Takasaki. December 31st, 1945, New Year's Eve by the Western calendar. But in Japan, the celebration of Oshigatsu was approaching. Despite the poverty, despite the cold, despite everything that had been lost, Fumiko insisted that tradition mattered. She appeared at Mitchell's quarters in the late afternoon, moving slowly through the snow, carrying something wrapped in cloth. The children had delivered her message earlier, come to her home at sunset. No explanation, just the invitation. Mitchell knew this violated Bradford's orders. He knew that accepting would give the Major exactly the excuse he needed for immediate court-martial. But he also knew that Fumiko would not ask unless it mattered. He went. The small house was warmer than usual. Fumiko had somehow acquired enough firewood to heat the main room. Chiyo and Hisako were there, Hisako still weak from her collapse, but insisting on participating. The three women had prepared something impossible. Ozoni, the traditional New Year's soup. Fumiko placed the bowl before Mitchell with ceremony, both hands steady, despite the tremor that had worsened over the winter months. The soup was served in a lacquered bowl that had survived the war, one of the few beautiful things remaining in the village. Steam rose from the surface, carrying scents that made Mitchell's eyes close involuntarily. Dashi, the fundamental broth of Japanese cooking made from kelp and bonito flakes that Fumiko had been saving for a year. The scent was oceanic and smoky at once, mineral-rich and profound, the smell of something that had taken decades to perfect and hours to prepare. Beneath the surface floated pieces of mochi rice cakes that represented prosperity and good fortune. Fumiko had made them from the last of her rice stores, pounding the grain by hand until her 74-year-old arms could barely move. The mochi were perfect white pillows, their surfaces smooth as silk. Daikon radish, sliced thin and translucent, floated alongside. Carrots cut into delicate flower shapes. A single piece of kamaboko fish cake with its distinctive pink spiral that must have cost Fumiko something precious to obtain. Scallions scattered on top like green confetti. Mitchell lifted the bowl to his lips, the warmth spreading through his frozen hands. The first sip of broth hit his tongue, and he understood why Fumiko had insisted on this meal. The umami was so deep it felt less like taste and more like memory, like the distilled essence of everything the ocean had ever been. The kelp provided mineral backbone, the bonito added smoke and depth, and somehow, impossibly, there was a subtle sweetness underneath that made the whole thing sing. He captured a piece of mochi with his chopsticks. The texture was extraordinarily chewy and sticky, resistant at first, and then yielding, stretching between his teeth like warm silk. As he chewed, the mochi released the flavor of pure rice, slightly sweet, perfectly plain, the taste of sustenance itself. The daikon was crisp and clean, a palate cleanser that made each subsequent bite taste fresh. The carrot added earthy sweetness. The kamaboko provided a bounce of texture, fish transformed into something delicate and refined. But it was the broth that overwhelmed him. Each spoonful coated his throat like liquid warmth, settling in his chest like comfort made tangible. The dashi seemed to carry 4 years of Japanese survival, all the discipline and care and attention to beauty that had persisted even when everything else had fallen apart. Mitchell ate slowly, reverently, understanding that this soup represented something more profound than food. Fumiko had made ozoni from ingredients she had been saving since before Pearl Harbor, from supplies she had hidden through bombings and starvation and occupation. She had saved them, not knowing if she would survive to use them, but trusting that if she did, there would be someone worth sharing them with. And she had chosen to share them with an American soldier, an enemy, a black man from Memphis who represented everything Japan had fought against and lost to. She had chosen to give him her New Year's soup. When he finished, Mitchell set down the bowl and looked at Fumiko, at Chiyo, at Hisako. 3 women who had given him their last rice, their last mochi, their last precious ingredients to make a soup that said, "You are family." "Why?" he asked in Japanese, the word coming out rough with emotion. "Why give this to me?" Fumiko smiled, and her answer was simple. Because you saw us. When the world said we were enemies, you saw us as human. This is how we say we see you too. Not as soldier, not as American, not as black or white. As James, as our son. Mitchell's throat closed completely. He bowed until his forehead touched the table and stayed that way for a long moment while tears fell onto the wood. Outside, the December snow continued falling on Takasaki. Inside, 3 elderly Japanese women and 1 young American soldier shared a silence that contained everything that words could not. This was peace. Not the peace of treaties or surrender documents, the peace of shared soup on a winter night, the peace of people choosing to love when the world demanded hate. 2 weeks later, Bradford would order Mitchell's final transfer. But this moment would remain untouchable, preserved in memory like the photograph he would carry for 57 years. The ozoni was the last meal Mitchell would share with the women of Takasaki. It tasted like gratitude and sorrow and hope, all mixed together. It tasted like goodbye and family, and the knowledge that some bonds survive any distance. It tasted like peace. The report about Mitchell bringing Hisako to the medical facility reached Major Bradford's desk on December 18th. He read it 3 times, his expression growing more rigid with each reading. Then he called for Mitchell. The meeting was brief. Bradford did not shout. He did not need to. Private Mitchell, you have consistently demonstrated an inability to maintain appropriate professional distance from the civilian population. You have violated direct orders prohibiting personal contact. You have prioritized individual relationships over military discipline. This cannot continue. He placed a document on the desk. You are being reassigned to Tokyo effective January 15th, 1946. From there, you will be shipped back to the United States. This is not negotiable. There will be no petition this time. There will be no delay. You have 30 days to prepare for transfer. Until then, you will have 0 contact with village civilians, except where absolutely required for official duties. If you violate this order, even once, you will be placed under arrest and transferred immediately. Do you understand? Mitchell stood at attention, his face carefully neutral. Yes, sir. Dismissed. Mitchell saluted and left, walking through the cold December air back to his quarters. 30 days. He had 30 days to say goodbye to the people who had changed his life. Except he was not allowed to say goodbye. He was not allowed to speak to them, to thank them, to explain what they had meant to him. He sat on his bunk and put his head in his hands. When the village learned that Mitchell was leaving for real this time, that the transfer was final and non-negotiable, something shifted in the women of Takasaki. They had petitioned, they had organized, they had found ways around regulations and prohibitions. They had fought for him with every tool they possessed, but some orders could not be resisted. Some endings were inevitable. Fumiko called a final meeting at the shrine on a cold evening in late December. We cannot keep him, she said, her voice steady, despite the weight of the words. They are taking him from us. But we can give him something to carry, something that says what we cannot say directly. What can we give? Chio asked. We have nothing. We have ourselves, Fumiko replied. We have our witness. We have our choice to love him when the world told us to hate. That is what we give. She pulled out the last of her good rice paper, the sheet she had been saving for something important enough to justify its use. This qualified. On the evening of January 14th, 1946, something happened that violated every regulation Major Bradford had put in place. Colonel Richardson, who had been monitoring the situation from his office in Saijo, made a decision. He authorized one final gathering, 1 hour, at the shrine, to allow the village to say goodbye to Private Mitchell. Richardson framed it as a diplomatic necessity, a gesture of goodwill that would help ensure smooth relations with the civilian population going forward. He buried the authorization in paperwork that would not reach Bradford until after the event had occurred. It was a small rebellion, a quiet act of conscience from a colonel who had lost his son and found himself unable to contribute to more unnecessary loss. The message reached Takasaki at noon. By evening, the shrine courtyard was filled. Not just the 200 women who had signed the petition, everyone. The elderly and the young, the mothers and the children, the families who had been touched by Mitchell's presence, even indirectly. They stood in the cold, their breath visible in the winter air, waiting. When Mitchell arrived, escorted by a corporal who looked uncomfortable with the entire situation, he stopped at the edge of the courtyard and felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of what was possible. They had come to say goodbye. All of them. Fumiko stepped forward, moving slowly, her body so thin it seemed impossible that she could still walk. But she walked with dignity, carrying something wrapped in silk. She stood before Mitchell and bowed deeply. Then she unwrapped the silk, revealing a photograph. It was the village, all of them, arranged in careful rows, holding a banner that read, "We need him." The photograph had been taken secretly at great risk by a traveling photographer who had passed through the village weeks earlier. It was evidence of unauthorized gathering of civilian organization, of exactly the kind of activity that could result in punishment. But it was also evidence of love. Fumiko handed Mitchell the photograph, then reached into her sleeve and pulled out a letter, folded carefully, the paper so thin it was almost transparent. She read aloud, her voice carrying in the cold air. "Dear James, you came to us as enemy. You leave as son. You showed us that war ends when we choose to end it. That peace begins when we choose to build it. That hate dies when we refuse to feed it. You will go home, we will stay here. But you will carry us. And we will remember you, not as American soldier, as family." She placed the letter in his hand. Mitchell tried to speak, but his throat had closed completely. He stood there, a 23-year-old soldier from Memphis, Tennessee, holding a photograph and a letter from people who had every reason to hate him and had chosen to love him instead. The tears came without permission, running down his face in the winter cold. Fumiko reached up and placed her hand on his cheek and said in English the words she had been practicing for weeks. "Thank you for see us human." Mitchell nodded, unable to form words, and understood that this moment would define everything that came after. That he would carry these people for the rest of his life. That he would never again be able to accept the simple categories of enemy and friend, us and them, the divisions that wars required, and that peace made obsolete. The next morning, January the 15th, 1946, a military truck arrived to take Mitchell to Tokyo. He packed his single bag of possessions, tucking the photograph and letter carefully into the inside pocket close to his heart. When he climbed into the truck, 200 women stood in the cold dawn, silent, watching. The truck began to move. Mitchell did not look back. If he looked back, he would not be able to leave. But as the truck turned the corner and Takasaki disappeared from view, his fingers touched the worn photograph through the fabric, and he understood that leaving did not mean forgetting. Some connections survived distance, some love survived separation, some peace once built could not be destroyed. The journey home took 3 weeks. Mitchell sailed from Yokohama to San Francisco on a transport ship crowded with soldiers eager to return to the country they had fought, for the country that had promised them dignity and freedom and the gratitude of a nation. Mitchell stood at the rail watching Japan disappear into the horizon, one hand pressed against the photograph in his pocket, and wondered what he was returning to. Memphis had not changed in his absence. The streetcar was still segregated whites in front, colored in back. The restaurants still had separate entrances. The drinking fountains still carried their polite designations. The war had ended, but the peace had not reached Tennessee. Mitchell found work as a welder in a factory that paid black workers 70% of what they paid white workers for identical labor. He married a woman named Dorothy who worked as a seamstress and understood without being told that something had happened to him overseas that he could not fully explain. They had 3 children. Mitchell taught them Japanese words. He told them stories about 3 elderly women who had shown him what courage looked like. He carried the photograph in his wallet every single day for 57 years, the paper growing soft with age, the image fading, but never disappearing. Every night before sleep, he would take out the photograph and look at those faces. Fumiko Chiyo Hisako. 200 women who had chosen love when the world demanded hate. He wrote letters to Takasaki. The first few were returned undeliverable. The occupation had ended. Addresses had changed, people had moved or died or simply disappeared into the machinery of post-war reconstruction. But in 1958, a letter arrived from Japan. It was from Fumiko's daughter, writing to inform him that her mother had passed away in 1963 at the age of 92, that Chiyo had died in 1968, that Hisako had survived until 1975. The letter said, "My mother spoke of you often. She called you her American son. She wanted you to know that you changed our village, that you showed us peace was possible, that we never forgot." Mitchell sat at his kitchen table in Memphis and cried for an hour. In 1996, at age 73, Mitchell did something he had been planning for 30 years. He returned to Japan. His children helped him book the flight. His wife, understanding what this meant to him, insisted he go, even though the cost was more than they could easily afford. Mitchell flew to Hiroshima, then took a bus to Saijo, then hired a car to drive him to Takasaki. The village had changed. New buildings stood where old ones had been destroyed. The well was still there, but it was no longer the center of village life. Running water had reached even rural areas. But the shrine remained. Mitchell walked slowly up the path, his 73-year-old body carrying the weight of decades, but moving with purpose. At the shrine entrance, a woman in her 60s was sweeping the courtyard. She looked up as Mitchell approached, and her face went very still. "Mitchell-san?" she asked quietly. He nodded, not trusting his voice. The woman dropped her broom and ran into the shrine building. Moments later, she emerged with 3 other people, all around Mitchell's age, all looking at him with expressions of wonder and disbelief. "My mother was Fumiko Watanabe," the woman said in Japanese. "She told me if you ever returned, I should take you to see what she left." She led him to the shrine's interior, to a small alcove where memorial plaques honored the dead. There, mounted on the wall in a simple frame, was a copy of the photograph, the same photograph Mitchell had carried for 50 years. Beside it was a plaque in Japanese and English, "Here in 1945, love conquered hate." Below that, 3 names and dates: Fumiko Watanabe, 1871 to 1963, Chiyo Nakamura, 1877 to 1968, Hisako Tanaka, 1883 to 1975. They chose to see humanity when the world chose to see enemies. Mitchell stood before the memorial for a long time, his hand pressed against his chest, where the original photograph rested in his wallet. Fumiko's daughter touched his arm gently. "She wanted you to know that you mattered, that what you did here mattered, that 50 years later we still remember that peace is something we choose." James Mitchell died in Memphis, Tennessee on March 11, 2003, at the age of 80. His children found the photograph in his wallet still there, after 57 years, the paper so worn it was barely holding together. In his will, he left instructions. The photograph was to be sent to the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum, along with a letter he had written in his final weeks. The letter said, "This photograph should not exist. In 1945, everything about it violated regulations and orders and the proper distance between conqueror and conquered. But it exists because 3 women decided that a soldier's humanity mattered more than rules. Because 200 women signed a petition saying that peace was more important than separation. Because love proved stronger than hate. I carried this photograph for 57 years. I carried it through segregation and civil rights struggles, and decades of trying to explain to people that enemies can become family if we simply choose to let them. Now I want the world to carry it. I want people to see these faces and understand that peace is not something that happens to us. It is something we build moment by moment, choice by choice, act of kindness by act of kindness. Fumiko, Chiyo, and Hisako taught me that. They taught me when I was 23 years old and lost and trying to understand what I had survived and why. They taught me that the answer to war is not victory. The answer to war is love. The photograph now hangs in the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum in a gallery dedicated to reconciliation and reconstruction. Thousands of people see it every year. They see a tall black soldier standing among 200 Japanese women, all of them holding a banner that says, "We need him." And they see evidence that the impossible happened, that in the ruins of war, in the aftermath of atomic weapons and total destruction, ordinary people chose extraordinary humanity. They see proof that peace is possible when we decide it is possible. And in Takasaki, in the small shrine where it all began, the memorial remains. 3 names, 3 women who refused to let hate have the final word. 3 women who, in choosing to love one soldier, showed the world what choosing peace looks like. The war had ended, but the peace they built continues.